Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales. Tales of amazing deeds, of momentous events of the past, told by me, Denton, from admittedly rather a humble location, but these gripping yarns of the past they are tales of magnificent achievements, great heroes, wonderful deeds, and I hope will keep you enthralled. And this time, I am looking once again at the Shieldmaidens. In part one, I was looking at the concept of women in combat in the Viking Age, and references to it in the sagas and various historical sources. Here in part two, I'm looking at the archaeological evidence, which is something concrete. It is there. It is provable. It doesn't rely on possibly romanticized or exaggerated stories or the fantasies of individual writers. No, archaeology is not open to accusations of human storytelling or the embellishing of the actual truth, nor are actual victories scored in modern-day sword combat, where women frequently beat men. Oh yes, and of course, they are restricted. They are restricted considerably by very strict rules to prevent injury, something that would not have handicapped the fighting ability of women 1,000 years ago. And I shall also, in part two, be looking at this entire question of, can a woman physically fight a man using the weapons of 1,000 years ago? The answer is yes, but I'll come to that shortly. Norse women buried with weapons of various kinds were not uncommon, and what a person was buried with, rather than the body itself, was always taken as the clue to their profession or status. But not every weapon was used for combat, obviously. Now, a bow or a spear could have been used by a hunter, and many women would have done so. And an axe could well have been used, and was, of course, for woodworking. A woodworking axe, it would bash somebody's skull in just as well as anything else. But those things are not of themselves proving of anything. They could have been used in warfare, yes, but there were also things used in everyday life which could have had a dual role. So that kind of weapon buried with a woman does not prove anything one way or the other. But, and this is a very important but, graves that contained what were clearly military rather than domestic weapons are quite another matter. Weapons of no domestic usage. Using a sword and a shield to go hunting wild boar, for example, well, that would have been nothing more than providing a nice, tasty meal for the boar. And two graves found over a century ago seem to indicate women, each of whom might well have been a real-life Lagavulin. One of them now actually admitted as such. Oh yes, accepted as a genuine warrior. The first is a grave from Undval in Norway, in which a woman about 20 years old was found buried with the full equipment of a Viking warrior. The whole thing, the sword, axe, 2 spears, arrowheads, and a shield. The second was found in Solar, Norway, in 1900, containing a thin, small woman about 18-20 years old and slightly over 5 foot tall, buried with a 2-edged sword, axe, spear, 5 arrowheads arranged around her body, and a horse, the latter indicating someone of importance, as well as tools. Now, her remains are displayed in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, and she was recently officially accepted as a warrior, and a genuine shield maiden, if you want to use that term, given both the type of weapons buried with her and an injury to her head, consistent with having been struck by a heavy, probably blunt object of some kind. There is a depressional fracture in her forehead just above the nose, and while it isn't certain if that would have been immediately fatal, it would probably have rendered her unconscious at the least. This has been seen as a very possible battle injury, and there is a very fine forensic reconstruction of her face, showing her with what the wound would probably have looked like. So, there is one officially acknowledged female Norse warrior, and the other woman's grave is so similar that we really must see her in the same light. The two graves are really almost identical in that context. Both these Norwegian graves clearly are military in nature. The manner of their burial set them apart from other female graves in that they were buried exactly the same as men, with weapons that had no other purpose than combat. As I said, nobody went hunting with a sword and shield, not if they wanted to stay alive at least. But strangely enough, these graves were ignored. Yes, they were ignored, despite their obvious significance with regard to the stories of the Shieldmaidens. And it wasn't until 2014 that a similar grave was thrust into public attention, a grave that was actually very little different, though the circumstances of its discovery, or I suppose rather we should say rediscovery, were very different. It caught popular imagination, and it raised no end of a debate, where the previous two had not. In fact, they had been, pretty much ignored. And it led to the re-evaluation of the solar grave. Viking graves had always been sexed, if you like, by what the person had been buried with. So, if they had weapons or tools, they were a man. If they had household items like cooking pots and jewellery, they were a woman. Simple and seemingly accurate, but flawed when used as the sole means of establishing sex, as we shall see, since it allowed for no possible exceptions. One of the finest of all warrior graves, identified as such by the items found in the grave, was documented in 1889 at Birka in Sweden. It was, in fact, the classic warrior grave, containing a man buried with his sword, axe, 2 spears, a large battle knife, bow and arrows, 2 shields, as well as 2 horses and a pair of stirrups. Note the similarity with the Unbal and Sola graves. There was no doubt that he was a warrior. Only a warrior would have a sword and a shield. Unlikely and highly dangerous things to go hunting wild boar with, to say the least, if you wanted to be the one eating the boar rather than it eating you. The arrows were of the armor-piercing type, which would be unsuited to hunting. The knife was for combat, not domestic use, and the 2 horses indicated someone of position and importance. Added to that was a set of gaming pieces that man obviously had been holding in his lap for a chess-like game, which was also used to plan strategy. Oh, yes. Now, indicating that the man must have been a military leader of some kind. A man, no question about it. Proof positive. But in 2014, a bioarchaeologist called Anna Kjellström of Stockholm University presented an astonishing argument. Now, she thought there was something a bit odd about the bones. She examined them, and she said, shock horror, they were the bones of a woman. Impossible, but weapons proved her to be a man. But if indeed it was a woman, everyone said, they weren't very careful back in the 1880s. They probably mixed up some of the bones, or there must have been more than one person in the grave. Of course, they couldn't explain where that other person had gone to, or indeed why there was no room in the grave for anyone else. Anyway, with the weapons clearly arranged around the one body, had there been another body beside that one, there would have been a gap where it was, and where did it go? It hardly got up and left of its own volition. So in 2017, Uppsala University went back to examine these bones, and they took 2 types of DNA, which showed that all the bones came from one body, and none had a Y chromosome. It was a woman, approximately 30 years old, buried with a formidable array of combat weapons, the time-honored method of proving that a person was a warrior. That settled the matter, right? No, I'm afraid it didn't. Bad archaeological practices in the 19th century, a mix-up of bones, poor record-keeping, despite a very careful and detailed drawing of the grave at the time of its discovery, of course. All these things were trotted out once again. There was even the laughable suggestion that the woman's husband, you see, had been a great warrior, and the weapons, presumably his, were buried with her as a tribute to him. Yes. To me, that made as much sense as suggesting that if she had been a famous dressmaker, they would have buried him with a roll of fabric and a sewing kit. No, they wouldn't. They'd have buried him with his weapons, not his wife. I've seen this, the weapons were a tribute of some kind, rubbish trotted out quite a bit lately. No, they were not. How could military weapons be a tribute to someone if that someone in life was not connected to fighting in any form? It is simply grabbing at straws to avoid having to admit the obvious. Some women had military weapons, whether or not they actually used them. Certainly they must have been entitled to do so, must have possessed them, must have been able to use them should the need have arisen, or they would not have been buried with them. Now, another person said that perhaps her husband perhaps he died elsewhere, and his weapons were thus buried with her. All right, so why did he go off somewhere without taking his weapons? I mean, he might not have taken all of them, but he would have taken his sword and probably the knife as well, and they would have been buried with him if his body couldn't be brought back. No man, especially a warrior, would have gone off somewhere without at least taking his sword. Others said, and this one's really good, others said that the presence of the weapons did not mean anything at all. They were not evidence of her status. No, they had nothing to do with it. The weapons had nothing to do with who was buried in the grave. Yet, very curiously, that was the very thing that proved, beyond any doubt, that a man had been a warrior. Combat weapons, and the body was a warrior, if it was a man. But the same weapons prove nothing at all if it was a woman. You don't have to be Mr. Spock to see how illogical that is. It was also pointed out by skeptics that she had no battle injuries. Aha! No sword or axe cuts on the bone. Well, nor had most of the men buried in the same locality, as it happened. Of course, there were 59 males buried nearby. Only 2 of them showed battle injuries, so the woman and 47 men were exactly the same in that regard. So does that mean that those 47 men were not warriors either? Obviously not. That idea also failed to take into account the fact that one could be stabbed with a sword or a spear without hitting bone, simply going through soft tissue, and thus leaving no trace whatsoever. The stomach or the abdomen, for example. Or she could have died of natural causes. There you are, natural causes. Not all warriors died in battle, even Viking ones, or received obvious injuries if they did. Only injury to bone would be visible on the skeleton. And look at the human body. How many places are there that you could be stabbed without hitting bone? The Solar woman, of course, did have an injury, though it may or may not have actually killed her. But again, even if it only rendered her unconscious, she could well have been killed by a sword or a spear thrust into her body that didn't hit bone. Even today, pathologists conducting autopsies on bodies of murder victims that have completely decomposed with only the bones remaining are often quite unable to give a cause of death, because unless bones were struck by a bullet or the blade of a knife, or bones in the neck were broken indicating a ligature strangulation, there is no trace of injuries to the soft tissue or the internal organs, which of course have gone. Often it is only by the confession of a suspect in the crime that the method of killing is actually discovered. So that takes the whole, she didn't have any injuries to her bones argument, completely out of the picture. But, interesting as the Birka grave is, why were the Anval and Solar ones completely ignored, and the Birka grave held up as the shining example of a possible Shieldmaiden? For a start, any doubts that lingered as to the bones being the right ones due to poor labelling did not apply to the other 2 graves, and the weapons are just as indicative of a warrior, as well as being so very similar, even to a horse, and one of the women having 2 spears, and one of them with an obvious injury. It is worth noting that more than 30 graves have been found across Scandinavia in recent times that contain women buried with various weapons, a number of them totally unsuited to hunting, household, or farm chores. If in another 1,000 years a woman was discovered buried with a helmet, a flak jacket, and an M16, I think the future archaeologist might possibly conclude that she had been a soldier. What do you think? Yeah, it seems pretty likely to me. I find it interesting that evidence which proves something beyond question, if a body is male, proves nothing if it isn't. And this, plus the ignoring of the two previous graves, despite their obvious implications, seems to me to be symptomatic of a male desire to play down the role of women in what would be considered a man's job. Something that sadly still lingers today. Open-mindedness is required in evaluating historical evidence of all kinds, and to ignore that which does not seem to fit a preconceived idea of what should be found in a grave, or to simply ignore it altogether, is, well, it's a very, very serious error. It's certainly extremely unscientific. But a few words about the case for female warriors, for those who think women couldn't be warriors. But warriors of our own time, though fighting with the weapons of the past, when we can see them fight, we don't have to try and reconstruct fights from the past, nor ask, well, could a woman have fought against a man with a sword? No, we can see them right there in front of us doing exactly that. My friend Dinah, very knowledgeable on historical matters and has worked on the Viking TV show, as it happens, a remarkable woman who I am very fond of, has been a most effective fighter in full contact armoured sword, axe and spear fighting over the years, with real weapons, swung at full force, though blunted of course, but still requiring the same strength, speed and skill of a real combat weapon of over 1,000 years ago. Now swords, like this one. This is steel. It is just as heavy as a genuine weapon. It is a genuine weapon, for that matter. It just doesn't have a sharp edge. And it hits every bit as hard, requiring the same strength to swing it as it would have required in Viking times. Note that fact. I think it's quite important to remember that. This weapon is exactly the same as a Viking warrior, male or female, would have carried. Plus, Vikings would not have been encumbered with all the padding and armour required for health and safety these days. Many, in fact, would have worn, no armour at all, often more just what they would have been wearing for everyday work. Many wouldn't even have had a helmet, so they would not have been as handicapped, if you like, by padding and the weight of armour. They would have been freer of movement, not as weighted down. So we can answer the question quite easily. Not could women fight against men with swords, was it possible 1,000 years ago, but rather can they do it? Can they do it in front of us and demonstrate to us that they can do it? Yes, they can. Dinah has routinely beaten men she fought against, not because she was massively large and strong, but because she was simply better than they were. Her skill, speed, and ability was superior to their brute strength. And very often, they hated it. Oh, they absolutely hated it. The alpha males beaten by a mere woman. Oh, the shame of it. How could they ever live it down? Another friend of mine, Ashka, against whom I have actually fought myself, and been gloriously beaten, I have to admit, is remarkably fast. Even those far more experienced than she is have great difficulty even getting a hit on her or blocking her strikes. In fact, none did on the nights that I saw her. And in shield walls that we were doing, all of us were killed a number of times, except her, since nobody could match her speed. Any question of size and strength was completely irrelevant. Her speed overcame that. Now these are two women easily able to take on a man and beat him by skill and speed, not physical size and strength. I have seen them do it. And had their weapons been sharp instead of blunted, the men they fought against would be dead. That is a very interesting point to keep in mind. Skill, training, speed, ability, and attitude can overcome sheer brute strength and size, as quite small men like, Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan have shown very convincingly against much larger opponents. And very obvious in judo, jiu-jitsu, and aikido, where women routinely throw or hold men larger than themselves, as do very small men for that matter. Plus the fact that the adrenaline, the desire to kill the enemy, perhaps the defense of the village and children, or just the knowledge that if she didn't kill him, he would kill her, that would have been present in a real battle 1,000 years ago. That's not present in a mock combat at a reenactment event or a training session today. Nobody's actually trying to kill you or kidnap your children. And that alone would make a great difference to the fighting ability of a woman in actual combat. And often, where women are beaten by men, especially in those videos that men love to put up on YouTube, the rules of all combat-related sports obviously favour size and strength, prohibiting any move that could cause injury or death, not allowing the gouging of eyes, the kicking of testicles, breaking fingers. The only way you can actually pull a man's hands off your throat, actually, is by pulling and breaking the little fingers, or punching the throat. Attacks that will bring down any man if a woman did it to him, as she would in genuine combat, where injuring or killing the opponent is the object. So, oh look, the man beat the woman in wrestling videos that you may see on YouTube might not be the case if a combat-trained woman with permission to use any technique to kill or maim was fighting the same man, and fighting with her life or the lives of those she cared about at stake. There are plenty of videos, incidentally, of women beating men, if you look for them, even in school competitions. But the alpha males, well, they much prefer to highlight the other kind, where the woman looks silly. And quite often, looking at it, I can see the woman is not really trained in martial arts. Dinah and Ashka can swing heavy weapons quite easily, with more than enough speed to counter the men, and with enough force that, were those weapons fully edged, they could kill those same men. Think about that. Had I fought Ashka in a real combat, not a training session, I would not be making this video. The same would be the case with Dinah. I wouldn't dream of taking her on with a real weapon. My friend Sean Richards suggested 3 criteria to establish if something historical relating to women is correct or false. He was commenting on accounts by Saxo Grammaticus regarding Shieldmaidens and warrior women in general. And his points are: 1. Carefully frame the questions. Is it possible for women to do the sort of things it recalls? 2. Acknowledge that admitting details the author, historian doesn't like are evidence of truth, but women beating men. That related to Saxo's grudging admission that some women did fight and have military skills, which he didn't approve of. And 3, are the people, places, and things involved real or testable? All right. In relation to this video, 1, is it possible for women to do what I've claimed? Yes, proven by history and by my own observation of female fighters doing the same thing today. 2, Saxo's admission of women with fighting skills in Denmark, something he didn't like. He didn't like it yet he didn't run it down. That's evidence of female warriors. If he didn't like it, he wouldn't make it up and praise them. He would have made it up and said they were completely and utterly useless. 3, female graves and military use only weapons in them are things that are real. The Rus invasion of Bulgaria is a historic, real, and testable fact, as are the female warriors mentioned in it. Female warriors in ancient Ireland are real, given the law enacted later to stop them training. If they weren't training as warriors, well, such a law was rather pointless, to say the least. So Sean's 3 criteria establish the truth of the evidence. To conclude, I must point out that apart from all the provable, solid historical accounts of females at war in many countries down through the ages, graves of unknown warrior women, like the ones at Birka and Sola, have been found in other parts of the world. Now, there's a splendid Celtic breastplate that was discovered in France, clearly made for a woman with twin projections for the breast, and another was found in India. And armoured women, clearly warriors, have been found buried in Anatolia, possibly being what the Greeks based their tales of the Amazons on. These women buried with armour, and many of them with battle injuries. I mean, there you are. There are battle injuries plus the armour and the weapons. So, while there may not have been dozens of shield maidens in every shield wall as we see in Vikings, we can say with almost complete certainty that there were Norse women on the battlefield on occasions, and at least one of them, or three if you want to count all the graves I mentioned, was a true Lagertha, and a lot more besides when you count the 30 other graves. And I hope that they may feast with the other warriors in Valhall, or even as guest warriors there, if they didn't actually die with a sword in their hands. Or indeed perhaps Freya, in her role as Queen of the Valkyria and chooser of the slain, took them instead to her Sasselmere, her own hall of heroes located in the field of Folkvanga in Åsgard. Note, now for anyone interested in the subject of female warriors in general, and a must-read, I should think, for any man who says, women shouldn't be in the army because they can't fight. No. There is a quite remarkable book that is not only historically intriguing, but also a monumental piece of pre-Google Age research. It is entitled Female Warriors, The Memorials of Female Valor and Heroism from the Mythological Ages to the Present Era, published in 1879 by the English author and artist Ellen Clayton, 1834 to 1900, who also wrote under her married name as Mrs. Needham. And there is a copy of this book. Well, while she does mention the mythological female warriors, such as the Amazons, 90% of the book, running to 425 pages over 2 volumes, is devoted to historically proven women warriors, hundreds of them from ancient times down to 1873. It's available from various sources, including Kindle, but my favourite is this edition by Forgotten Books, which is www.forgottenbook.com, who reprint it as a facsimile of the original book, so you can read it exactly as people did in 1879. As I said, it's available in a Kindle edition, though in a modern format. Now, this is a real eye-opener for anyone who thinks women never marched off to war, and I highly recommend it. Despite its age, it is probably the finest book I've ever seen on the subject, mentioning women who you won't find listed anywhere else. I'll give a link to it in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this true story of the Shield Maidens, and until next time, I shall say farewell and goodbye